all it involves is a little bit more breathing. So you take a breath and then you start speaking and everyone can hear you. But some of us
Good teaching. Yeah.
couldn't resist that.
Keep
So
breathing.
introducing Shraddhasiddhi, whose name means he whose accomplishment is faith or confidence in the Buddha's vision. And we first met on a Women's Week Order weekend in 2012 at Padmaloka.
So true story.
Yeah, true story. Yes, a true story. And before we had this place, Padmaloka used to, well, they used to open their doors very generously for the Women's Order weekends for a few years. There you go. So Shraddhasiddhi first got involved at the LBC in 2001, was ordained in 2012. And we have been in a online chapter together now for 8 years. Gender diverse chapter. Great. Anyway, I shall now leave you to your talk.
Thanks, Jana Mitra. Thanks, Jana Mitra. I'll try and remember to breathe when I speak, but if I don't breathe, tell me to breathe and like show me with the volume. So yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's really lovely to be here with you. There's about 40 of us here at Adhisthana on the Gender Diverse Retreat. So it's our largest gender diverse retreat that we've had, and yeah, particularly delighted to continue order members and mitras and people who want to become mitras kind of gathering together. It definitely feels like things are growing. So yeah, it feels really great to be here again. And yeah, I wanted to share a little bit about my inspiration for the theme of the weekend. So it did somewhat come through some inspiration I had, but very much the team were really, really open to it. And yeah, I thought it would be good for us as a gender diverse Sangha to explore these topics. So the topic is the group, the true individual, and the spiritual community. And most of the material you can find on those topics were from, they're basically a series of lectures and teachings from Sangharakshita in the sort of late 60s. He started talking about the themes and also went well into talking throughout the 1970s. So quite a long time ago. And most of the material you can now find in the book, What is the Sangha? There's also a year 2 Sikha project course. I think it's year 2, module 2, introduced by Ratnaguna. And it has its own kind of booklet, and it gathers together a range of the themes. So yeah, there's plenty of material that you can sort of follow up if you're interested. And some of you have probably studied it before. I think it's been very much around as quite a key reflection or yeah, key topic for us in the movement. So even though Bhante began in 1960s and 70s talking about it, it feels like it stood the test of time. And yeah, why the idea spoke to me, and I thought it would be useful for us is, well, I was just reflecting on this idea of sort of group membership. So in a certain way, we are human beings that like to group together. We seem to do that from early times in our lives. So, and I think particularly for gender diverse people, this theme of being in a group or belonging is really, really key. So sometimes we feel like we don't belong. And that's why evoking the sort of group and in a way, what it takes to be a true individual, to stand in one's own authentic experience, to speak one's truth, for some of us to come out in certain ways. Well, we do that a lot. We do that one might say all the time. We're making decisions about whether to be our true selves or not. It can be daily, can't it? So I think it's quite an evocative theme for us. And I think it's something that isn't linear. So I'll take us through Bante's teachings in a fairly linear way, but you might say, so Bante has this teaching about being part of a group, which is more when you get into like group mindset and group thinking, and it's a bit dull and uncreative. And then he charts the path in a way sort of out of that to be a true individual. So to find out what we really think and feel about things, to be more true to our own experience, and to start to practice the Dharma, and very much in an experiential way. So he sort of is evoking in a way like a group, and then what it's like to be a true individual. And then he says a spiritual community is made up of true individuals, which is an interesting concept for us. I don't know if you feel like you're part of a spiritual community. And I don't know if you feel like you're part of a true spiritual community, if there are true individuals in the Triratna community. Bante says that often there's just a few true individuals in any spiritual community. So it's an interesting thing for us to reflect on, like, is the Triratna order a spiritual community in the truest sense? Or is it more like a positive group? So Bante talks about, in a way, sort of more negative groups and also positive groups. So it is the movement and the order more like a positive group. So we'll be sort of exploring some of those themes. And I wanted to confess that partly my inspiration for the theme came out of feeling slightly irked by some of the dialogues in our movement around affinity groups. So partly I was kind of picking up in people who are not in particular affinity groups in our movement, that they don't necessarily think that, say, an affinity group for gender diverse people is a good thing. So I think in recent years, so most of you will know our dominant affinity groups, so groups where people come together because of a shared characteristic, is our single sex structures and practices and groups. So that is our dominant affinity group. But nobody really calls it that, do they? It's like it somehow is the background wallpaper, someone might say. And nobody really questions, I think, sometimes why we are in those affinity groups. We sort of vaguely know, and perhaps we ask people, why do we do this? And you'll get varying responses depending on who you ask. But it's good for us to reflect, those of us that do participate in single sex affinity groups. What are we doing it for? What do we get out of it? In what way does it help our practice? And of course, for many of you, you won't want to be in single sex spaces. Many of you are non-binary identified. You don't fancy squeezing yourself into something that's more binary, or it's very difficult or painful to be in those spaces. There's something about sort of just clocking that the movement does have a dominant affinity group structure. And then I think in the last few years, it became much more rich in terms of, we'd always had affinity groupings in certain ways. But I think what's become much more rich and much more strong are the affinity groups, particularly around people of colour. I think particularly sort of post George Floyd's murder and COVID times, it felt like very much people of colour were wanting to be together and form a sort of affinity space, so that in a way people can feel more themselves, away from, in a way, the white gaze, away from questions around identity in a particular way and certain dynamics. And also, I think the LGBT Sangha has begun to sort of be more alive. along with a gender diverse Sangha. And I suspect gender diversity has pushed these LGBT spaces. So, we have things like Pasadena running a retreat in Dharnakosa each year, an LGBTQ space. We do that at the London Buddhist Centre as well. So, yeah, it feels like there are these affinity groups. And this affinity group has been going for almost 10 years. It's almost our 10th retreat. But it does feel like what can happen is that people looking in think somehow we're doing something subversive or radical in some way. Of course, we are radical. Of course, we are subversive, but probably not in the way that's perhaps I'm going to use this word, projected onto us. So, we exist, don't we, in the wider world, and there's something about, I think, particularly if we look at gender diversity, but also race, the projection is of badness, that if we group together, somehow we're up to no good, we're not good people, our motives are questioned. And of course, for us, we have to remember we're a Buddhist movement. So mainly when we're meeting in these affinity groups, we're practicing the Dharma, we're sharing our inspiration, and we're also opening up a bit more to, in a way, the background of our lives that might be harder for us to open and share if we were not in these affinity spaces. So yeah, there's a lot of sort of goodness, in a way, I feel, being part of a gender diverse Sangha, that sometimes doesn't get talked about or celebrated. And sometimes the negative press can press on one. And of course, as an order and a movement, we're not completely separate from the world, are we? So the culture wars can play out in our movement because we are people and we are people of the world. We're not some sort of squirreled away spiritual community trying to ignore what's happening in the world. We're trying to practice and be in the world. We're not a sort of secluded monastic community. We're a bunch of people who are trying to practice a spiritual life, but in the world. So so we're of the world as well. So I think I just wanted to share a slightly poignant reflection for me on this single sex affinity group thing in Triratna. So in a couple of weeks' time, I'll go to Padmaloka for my second time. Yana Mitra mentioned the first time, and that was for me in 2012 on a women's order weekend. So very enjoyable to see Padmaloka. I wouldn't have normally seen Padmaloka, but this time I'll be returning as a guy going on a guy's retreat. And what feels quite poignant to me is I feel, well, A, ready to do that. B, I feel like the team there are welcoming enough for me to feel comfortable stepping forth into it. And that's partly because people in this room have been to Padmaloka and have found a relatively warm reception. So that has really encouraged me to sort of step over the threshold, as it were. But I'm very aware of the background politically as I do that. It may well coincide with the government saying that I can't do that. And so, there's a very bittersweet kind of feeling. And I know that it touches the lives of all of you. This sort of terrible political backdrop we have at the moment that feels like particularly trans women are very much vilified and seen as problems, and that means that the whole of the sort of gender diverse community can be somewhat tainted by just views about us that are pretty much not true. And yet we sort of swim in these waters, don't we, where we're sort of, I find myself waiting a bit like, the sword is about to come down or something, waiting for the next injury, waiting for the next barrier, waiting for the next view that will restrict what we want to do and who we want to be with. So it's a very sort of delicate time and sensitive time. And I find myself certainly news scrolling, maybe doom scrolling at times. And I noticed a couple of days ago in Louisiana, in the States, in the southern United States, the Supreme Court there had just overturned a trans bathroom bill, which was to ban a young boy from accessing the boys' toilets in his school. He was a young trans boy. And the Supreme Court agreed with the boy that he should be able to access the boys' bathroom, and said there was no evidence to suggest that anything would happen if he did. And that's a kind of a very true point, isn't it? It's like all of these things we face. We face a bathroom bill, a bathroom ban in the UK as well. All of this is really built on just no evidence. So we hope that truth and sense of justice will prevail in terms of, there's no evidence, then why are we being discriminated against? Why is there this level of prejudice? But we're existing in this time, I feel, where we're just, pausing. We're just on pause to see what kind of horror awaits us next. So it's a very, difficult time. So I'm not sure everybody quite understands that, but I know you do in the room, and that's partly why we're here, isn't it? We want to seek a slight refuge from this kind of nonsense, I was going to say. So yeah. So I was going to just share a little bit about me, and you heard a little bit about me from Yana Mitra, but I thought it would help get us into this idea of, I'll start to talk about the group, as Bhante calls it. So there's this sense of, we are kind of group-like creatures, yeah? We like to be around each other. We seem to be collective animals, you might say. So I was just going to share a little bit about my walking into Triratna, and how I experienced myself as somewhat part of different groups, and then what happened when, in a way, I found a spiritual community. So I came along in 2001 to the London Buddhist Centre, and a lesbian friend of mine had recommended the Buddhist Centre, and she said, don't worry, they won't turn you into a Buddhist. They'll just teach you meditation, and then you can get out of there. And I was like, yeah, that's what I want. I said to her, look, I'm queer. I don't want organized religion. I think it's probably quite homophobic. I was worried about that at the time. And she really reassured me. She said, they won't even mention Buddhism once. And I was like, oh, okay, cool. They sound quite cool. And sure enough, they didn't. It's changed slightly now. I would be a bit worried if we didn't mention Buddhism. But back then, it was very much like, I came to the Buddhist Center. I was taught to meditate. Vimla Chitta was my first meditation teacher. Very sort of kind of young woman, very, very good teacher. Really inspired me that there was a young woman teaching. I had all these projections onto the spiritual community that it would be very cisgendered and straight, and there'd be lots of men, and it did kind of confound me. And one of the things that confounded me about the London Buddhist Centre was there was a lot of queer people. So I think that also helped kind of break that projection I had that was like, oh, it won't be for me. But I wasn't that keen on Buddhism, and what I used to do was avoid talking to any Buddhists. So anybody who wore a kesa, I avoided them, and I used to peruse the bookshop in the breaks at the Buddhist Centre, looking at all the titles and trying to avoid everyone's eye contact. I was painfully shy, and but the one thing that did happen to me was on about week 4 of the course, we were told to meditate every day on the course. So we'd go home, so like a weekly course. And of course, every week I'd go home and I wouldn't meditate every day. I'd like come back and be like, no. And everybody else would be like, no, I didn't. didn't do that. And then on week 4 of the course, I did do that. I sat on a couple of big Yellow Pages books, which some of you are old enough to remember, these big tomes, and I sat for at least 5 or 10 minutes every day, and something happened to me. It was like my imagination opened, and I had very strong images, very strong visual images, and it was like the door to my imagination had opened, and I never really realized it was closed. And it felt like it had been open in my childhood, and I was 26 when I was sitting on the Yellow Pages, and it felt like it had returned from somewhere, like my imagination, my sort of that faculty that we've all got. Here it was, and it was very rich, and it was very strong. And in my first year of meditating, I did experience a lot of beginner's mind, a lot of different types of states of mind. And also I had dreams, very vivid dreams, sometimes very dark dreams. And I remember really worrying about that. But by then I'd gone back to another course with the Buddhists. And they said, don't worry, some people experience these dark dreams. It's like an integration, an integrative process. And I didn't realize that I was coming to the Buddhist center for these things. Yeah, I thought I was coming to learn to meditate. I wanted to be less stressed. I was an HIV activist. That was my job. I was very angry. I was a hard drinker. I would argue a lot. And here I was at the Buddhist center, and they taught me the Metta Bhavana, and that didn't really fit with my lifestyle. And so over a period of time, I kind of realized that I did want to practice the Metta Bhavana, and I didn't want to be yelling at people when I was drunk in pubs, and that those two things were in conflict. So over my first year of being with the Buddhists, I gave up alcohol, and I have not drunk since. And so it was a very big kind of turning for me. It was a very big moment of, in a way, this imagination had opened. And I trusted that. I didn't trust all the Buddhists. I didn't really understand what was happening to me. But one thing I knew was my imagination had opened, and also my emotional life had started to open. And I'll just give you this example of how closed I was. I joined a women's right livelihood business, an evolution gift shop. And every day I would go in and I would say, they would all say, do like a little check-in circle. And they would all say how they felt. And I would always say that I was fine. I'd be like, hello, I'm fine. And then at one point, somebody erupted on me and was like, you can't always be fine. And I was like, yeah. And that began a period of time of actually working out, well, what did I feel? And what did I think about things? But very much that emotional side of me had been very, very blocked and suppressed. And for me, that meant exploring more than Buddhism. I went into 12-step fellowship for addiction, and also I went to therapy because I just had no idea how I felt at all. I could not name any emotion that I felt. I had to literally try and have people around me help me and teach me that there is a range of emotions, and to try to be literate about naming them. That was a big thing for me. So yeah, there was a sort of sense of opening, I suppose. And I didn't realize that what Bhante calls the group, in terms of the groups that we sort of belong to, in a certain sense, the groups I belonged to weren't enough for me. So I belonged to this group at work of angry HIV activists, and well, I'm still an HIV activist, so I can still get angry about things. But it was like that was part of my identity, and these days I'm looser around that. But what we used to do is go out and drink together. That was our dominant mode of letting off steam and putting the world to rights. So it was fulfilling in one way, but it's not super meaningful, is it? It's like going out and getting drunk together. I realized it had its limits. And And also most of that time I was sort of around on the queer scene in London, and I felt it was just very orientated towards drinking, and therefore all the trials and tribulations of drinking, not really taking each other in, not being very kind to each other, getting into fights, and it was just drama. And I had somewhat removed myself from my family. My family of origin were super cis het normative, and from the independent Republic of Yorkshire that we were talking about before. And all I wanted to do was be away from that group, as I saw it, that family group, and those social norms. It was the 1990s, and queer people did still not have a very good press. So it was like I was in a group and I needed to move away from it. But the group I found was somewhat like I belonged, but then it was like it was lacking as well. And I suspect that's a familiar journey for many of you. I can see some of you nodding. It's like we sort of outgrow sometimes our various groupings, and it doesn't mean that we leave them all together necessarily, but we yearn for a group, I think, that will bring us on more, that is interested in us from a more growthful way. And that's kind of what Bhante is suggesting when he calls this sort of the group, the negative group in a way. What happens to us psychologically when we're involved in those groups. And it doesn't stop, doesn't it? It's not like we grow out of that. Like we're all in different groupings, aren't we? Maybe some of us work, so you're in a group there. So it's all happening all the time. It's not like there was a time where I was into the group and now I'm not. It's like it's a practice in a way to be skillful in any group that we're in. And of course, the movement and the order can be a group. And if we're lucky, it's a positive group. It's really interested in our development and our growth. But if we're unlucky, we can find ourselves at times in the movement and the order in groupings where we don't feel maybe that our growth and other people's growth is really centered. It's not, a healthy group. Something's gone a bit wrong maybe. And that happens because we're people. And, we're trying to practice these spiritual principles, try to practice in a way what Bhante has given us, but we don't always live up to it. Yeah, it's hard to form a positive group and keep the group positive, and then it's even harder to be a spiritual community. So I want to say something about what happens if we do manage to tread this path of being a true individual. So Bhante evokes in a way, and I evoked, didn't I, this slight loosening to group. So, there's something happened when I realised that getting drunk most nights and arguing about world politics with my HIV activist friends was just a bit limiting. There was more to me. And it mainly happened because I was doing the Metta Bhavana in the morning, and then I was drinking in the evening. And like my very last drink that I had was I'd met some person that I didn't even know, a stranger, and I started to have, a very heated political argument about the state of the world. And I just was like, it was like one of those insight moments. I was like, what am I doing? I'm doing loving kindness in the morning, and I'm doing raging and I'm really drunk in the evening. And I had a terrible hangover that next morning. And I thought, this makes no sense, and I'm not going to do it anymore. This sense of the meditation and the loving kindness, it was more. And I knew it could bring out more of me. I knew I could grow and develop. So in a way, I don't know why I didn't feel that the week before or the week before that or the month before that, but at some point something clicked, and in a way I was let out of something. So Bhante says there's these 9 qualities of a true individual, and I'm going to just talk about them fairly quickly, but I want to sort of evoke them, and we can spend more time this weekend thinking about them. And one or two of them might speak to you a bit more than others. So he's talking about the positive qualities of the true individual. So you might say being an individual is like a practice. Yeah, it's like something we try and practice. So the first one is that you're free from group conditioning, or comparatively free, and you see through your own conditioning. You are somewhat aware of the history of the world and how it has come to be. You are aware that there are other ways of seeing the world than just yours. He also adds maybe you might have travelled. Yeah, there's something about our, we've got individual journeys, haven't we, and individual paths, and maybe some of us are aware, much more aware of, say, other parts of the world. But there's something about just taking in the fact that we have views and that other people have other views, and that is the truth of the matter, and that you're on a bit of a hiding to nothing if you insist that your views are the way the world is. Because the world doesn't have a truth like that. It just has perceptions and perspectives. And we all have different perceptions and perspectives. So becoming sort of comparatively free of that idea, of that group conditioning of like, I know what's best, I know the truth, is, it's quite rich, isn't it? I mean, even if we just spent the entire weekend looking at that, that would be, it's enough for a lifetime, that one. So the second one is that you are self-conscious, in that you have developed enough awareness to know something about yourself, what you think and feel, and you know what you're doing and why. So he didn't just leave it, did he? You know what you think and feel. It's like you know what you're doing and why. It's like he's just constantly upping the ante a bit. And for me, when I first came to the Buddhist center, I didn't know how I felt. I could not name my feelings at all. And maybe for some of us, that's enough of a thing to be working on. Particularly those of us who experienced, sort of traumatic backgrounds, or, dysfunctional families, or, often it's so common to either suppress your feelings or just be totally out there with your feelings. And, to have more of a sort of sense of, who are we, and how are we actually, what's this body and how do I feel, is quite a teaching. So the third one is that you are somewhat able to stand alone from the mass of humanity. You are not slavishly following some of the modern isms. And I've just put things like addictions, consumerism, capitalism. So that's why this sort of group think is quite important, isn't it? Like, there are agendas out there that, like capitalism does want us to buy more. Yes, Amazon is not our friend. No. Even Netflix, isn't it? It's like they show you the next episode before you can even decide whether you want to see the next episode or not. So there is a moment where you can press pause on the Netflix episodes, but they've kind of set it up so we don't. Yeah. So more is perhaps something for us to look at. How do we feel about more? Does it do us any good? So number 4 is you're not psychologically dependent on others. That is, you do not require the approval of the group for your peace of mind, and the disapproval of the group will not pressurize you into changing your mind. If need be, you need to go it alone. So that's a real biggie, isn't it? It's you're not psychologically dependent on others. So I notice when I see the latest anti-trans headline, it can be really easy to get drawn in and to think, oh, those others, they don't like me and my friends. And, it's very difficult to sort of, in a way, unhook ourselves from the views of others and just be with that sense of like, you know what, I'm fine. We as a people are fine. We are good people, rather than the newspaper headline that says you're bad. So to develop some sense of positive, robust, psychological kind of health is, I think particularly for us, a really big ask. And again, more than a lifetime's work for us often. So in order to, I'm going to pause, that was number 4, before I say the last 5. So in order to develop some of these things, Bhante says it'd be really good if you meditated. It'd be really good if you have an ethical practice. It'd be really good if you have spiritual friends. Because to do those things on our own, so to speak, is really, really difficult. We could try and do it on our own, and then we'll be like with a group of people, we'll be like, no, I'm psychologically independent from you. I'm a true individual. It becomes very obvious quite quickly that perhaps we're not. So we're not very good judges of ourselves sometimes. And things like meditation and the practice of ethics, they're sort of life practices. So the more you do of those, the more you loosen and your view opens, doesn't it? I know at a certain point after meditating for quite some years, I realized just how fickle my views are. And it's a really unpopular thing to say, isn't it? Like, people would like to know, who are you and what are your views and what do you stand for? Well, I'm a Buddhist and I know that my views are quite fickle. And sometimes I think this, and then sometimes my view broadens. And I'm not so sure. I'm not so attached to my views in a certain way. But it doesn't mean that I don't stop thinking and reflecting and trying to be clear what I think. It's just maybe I realize it's just the world is not as I think it is. That kind of practice. Okay. So number 5 is, Bhante says, a true individual has this freedom and this ability for self-determination. And with that comes creativity. So a true individual will be creative. So there'll be some sort of creative mind, which may well come out in like creative pursuits. Looking at Bamba with the knitting, yeah. It's like there's a sort of sensibility, isn't there? There's something about creativity that has a particular energy. And I think, this is one of the things that Bhante has sort of drawn out. He has a very sort of intuitive energy. And so the sort of creative pursuits that we have, he would really, really encourage that kind of creative energy. It's a spontaneous energy. And he says, number 6, with this independence of a true individual, you might have to accept that you'll be unpopular. So for some of us, we might have those samskaras that we're like people pleasers, don't really want to rock the boat, we're really scared of rejection. Or Bhante says, if you want to be a true individual, you've got to build this resilience. You may well be unpopular. People will disagree with you. They will argue with you. They may well look unfavorably at you. Number 7, the individual develops emotions that are positive and refined. So you take responsibility for your mental states and you realize that your emotional responses are self-created. So that's quite big, isn't it? We're going to take responsibility for ourselves and we realize that our minds create the emotions that we have. I don't know how you feel about developing emotions that are positive and refined. It's possibly not popular, isn't it? I haven't seen it on the internet. Develop emotions that are positive and refined. I think it's a really interesting thing to reflect on for those of us that maybe feel emotionally blocked or slightly suppressed. It's like sometimes to get in touch with much more crass emotions, but that's a process. And over a period of time, I guess what you might be looking for is, if you've got an effective practice, you might have a sense of something a bit more equanimous or refined or positive. So obviously the positive direction is great, but there's something about that word refined. To me, it suggests a more integrated and more collected response to situations. You might be a bit more balanced. Number 8, your energies flow freely, spontaneously, cleanly, and harmoniously. You don't have any hang-ups, blockages, or inhibitions. If only, eh? Your energies flow freely, spontaneously, cleanly, and harmoniously. You don't have any hang-ups, blockages, or inhibitions. But I think that's a really good one for us. There's something for me about sort of queerness, that many of us have walked this path where we grew up in a society that says you should suppress your kind of desires, whether that's same-sex desire or your desire maybe to transition, around gender identity. And yeah, there's something about having energy that is free flowing, having processed these paths we walk, and trying to unblock the emotional blockages that stop us being more free, less inhibited, um, less fearful. So even speaking out about our identities, being visible in the world, maybe as a trans person or a non-binary person, these are things that really can inhibit us. And of course it's co-created, isn't it? It's not like we created it. It's like the world co-creates it with us. But we know it when we see it, don't we? We know this less inhibited people. It's like they somehow, something in us responds and thinks, oh, I want to step through that door. I want to be in that space. I love that energy. So yeah, we sort of know it. And Bhante said this is the whole hallmark of a true individual. I really like that he says no hang-ups, blockages or inhibitions. So you're not looking. A true individual wouldn't be like stiff and kind of restricted and kind of, I don't know, uptight, like, which I find quite good. Not that I don't think I'm that much in danger of being like that, but probably need to contain it slightly. But yeah. So the final one is you are alone. So you realize when you're a true individual that you are alone. So to be an individual in a sea of non-individuals or group members, you realize that you are alone. But you don't want to be alone. You want to have a spiritual community. You want to have a community of fellow people who are true individuals as well. And I think it's worth dwelling on what Bhante means by you're alone, because we can practice being alone. So we can practice times where we're receiving less input and information, the sense of, just being with ourselves. We can go on things like solitary retreat. You can develop the capacity for aloneness. It's not just that we wake up one day and we think, oh yeah, I've realized I'm alone. So there's a whole sense of that. And we don't want to be alone. So we're both alone and we don't want to be. We want to be with other true individuals. And I think most people have a sense of what Bhante means when he says that. So just another final sort of quote from Bhante. So you take responsibility for and accept responsibility for your own growth, for your own life, and the effect that your life has on others. And you act accordingly. As you see this individual growth, this fulfilling of potential is the most important thing. And the most important thing to you is that others can grow and develop too. So not only have you found it and seen it in yourself, but you've realized this liberating path. You really want that for others as well. So I'm just going to recap, and then I'm just going to talk for the last 10 minutes about the spiritual community. So I said a little bit about the group and the sort of group that might hold us back. The group that sort of shapes us as group members, the samskaras we have, the habits that we have, where they come from. We didn't just spring into this world with our own views. We were around people who had views. Age 2, 3, 4, whenever your first memory is, you are shaped by the people around you. We like to think, don't we, that we're individual little beings, but we learn things in relationship with others. So we are shaped and formed by the groups that we've been most around. So I have been around lots of people from Yorkshire. So I have particular Yorkshire habits. People say that Yorkshire people are outspoken. So this is not an individual trait of mine. It is a trait of the Yorkshire people. So, we've all been shaped in lots of different ways. And part of our work is to sort of reflect on that and to unpick it slightly. So, for example, I don't know, I'm going on about Yorkshire. Being from Yorkshire, if you there can be a culture that's outspoken and direct, not necessarily refined. So that word refined, that positive emotion and the refining, that is a different kind of quality. Not that Yorkshire people don't have those qualities or can't develop them, but there are all these sort of cultural norms, aren't they, that we need to sort of free ourselves from. They're kind of good fun in some ways, and they can be limiting, and some can be very harmful. I want to just talk a little bit about moving on to the spiritual community, or a collection of true individuals, is what Bhante calls the true spiritual community. So I remember a certain point, it's around 2016, and I was working at the London Buddhist Centre. I was the women's Mitra convener, and over a period of a couple of years, I thought, no, I'm not a woman. Just awkward. Yeah. And so I started to identify as being non-binary, and I started to come here on these retreats, these gender diverse retreats. And, out of the corner of my mind, I realized this was awkward, this non-binary identity, because I was a women's Mitra convener. And but what I remember most about those years was meeting particularly trans and non-binary people on these retreats. And I remember going back on the train, sometimes with people from the retreats. And I remember something happened to me when I got on the train. I would just be slightly aware that, like, maybe I was like these people. And I think it was particularly trans identified people. I was like not quite willing to let in that maybe there was a closer identification within me. Maybe there was a little wee trans person within me. And it was like I was just sort of on the train on the way back, this slight sense pushing from the side slightly of like, oh, maybe I'm like them. And it was like I wasn't really quite willing to open to that. And there was some fear and there was some resistance. But I had also joined the order. And what that meant to me was the commitment to open to whatever is there. So although I could see it pressing dimly at my side, the side here, I sort of knew that one day I would just have to open to it. And it took me 4 or 5 years to open more fully. And it was in the COVID pandemic that I more fully opened. And I think it wasn't a coincidence. I needed to leave the LBC. I needed to leave my job as women's Mitra convener. I needed to leave living in a women's community. I needed the time and space of a lockdown in a pandemic. I needed the non-relationship with others in order to find my way, my confidence, my voice. And in a way, there's no manual to being a true individual, is there? Like, I needed to do those things. Maybe somebody else could have stayed and worked with all of that, all that relationship, all that kind of transition. For me, it felt way too public to be at the London Buddhist Centre and in that smallish community. And so on one level, you could say I wasn't enough of a true individual to make that journey in more of a sort of relational way. But in another way, you could say that the people around me weren't enough of true individuals either for me to feel like I could feel comfortable and safe to do that. And so that's where this idea of like, okay, what is a spiritual community then? Why did I not feel, I felt very loved in some ways. I felt very well connected. I'd been around that Sangha for a really long time, but I did not feel like I could walk this transition path in public view at that time. So I guess there's like a few sort of nods that Bhante gives towards what a spiritual community is. So when he's given his lectures in 1970, the order is very small, if not non-existent. There's like a couple of order members, yeah. And he's saying, in order to be a true individual, you need to focus on all the 9 things that I've said. And you need to, in a way, the shorthand would be you need to effectively go for refuge. Yeah, you need to be working towards going for refuge. You place this commitment. There's a commitment towards awakening, towards enlightenment, to following the Buddha. But he also says that true spiritual communities are really small and they only have a few people in them who are true individuals. And he never corrected that over the years. He never sort of said, oh, I was talking to the order when we were really small. He never went back or said anything about that. He just said that a spiritual community is a group of true individuals. And I think in a certain way, he was evoking that predominantly Triratna is a positive group. And that the true individual with all those really amazing qualities are probably few and far between. But what he did say was you need to find people who are more like that in order to have connection with them. So maybe for some of us, we have found some people in this movement that feel like they're more like that, or they are like that, or they sort of bring us on. Yeah. So he often talks about ideals, doesn't he, Sangharakshita? So you perhaps could say it's an ideal. Perhaps the true individual is awakened, is the awakened one. Yeah, that's what it evokes for me. And even the Buddha was in a positive group. He had followers, didn't he? And some of them were awakened, and some of them were not. They were sort of trying. So that perhaps is a more realistic way of thinking about our order and our movement. I think the point where you join the order is predominantly a point where you make a commitment to making your going for refuge real. So you have realized that it's possible to wake up. And you might not be awake, and you might not be a true individual, and you might not be completely liberated or free. But something in you has turned from a point where maybe you don't feel like that is particularly easy sort of ideal or place that you can work through. You've made a commitment to work towards it. And in the words of sort of Bhante, as clarified by his talks with Subhuti in the 7 papers, more recently, you make a commitment to make your effective going for refuge real. So you're making a commitment to, if your going for refuge is real, traditionally you would say, and Bhante has said, that you break the first 3 fetters. So in a way, Bhante is saying that when you join the order, you make this commitment. If you break the first 3 fetters, you are said to be at the point of no return. You do not go back. So Bhante was often saying, wasn't he, if we practice, enlightenment is guaranteed. So he's very much encouraging us to make our effective practice real. Which means loosening to rites and rituals as ends in themselves, which is a sort of groupy thing, isn't it? It's like our rites and rituals that we have. It's like we loosen to them as, they might, like, say doing a puja might be really, really helpful for our mental states, but we don't always want to do a puja, and neither should we. So it's like we choose when we engage with our rites and rituals for good effect. We go beyond doubt. So we break the fetter of doubt. And also we see through the sense of self. So it's a bit perverse Buddhism. It tells you that you have to really, really get to know yourself. Bhante was really, really big on this. You need to get to know yourself. When you truly know yourself, you're more integrated, you're more whole, there's more energy available for awakening, yeah? There's more energy available for everything. So you need to spend a long period of time really getting to know yourself, doing these more integrative practices, mindfulness of breathing, ethics, yeah, you also, when you join the order, commit to an insight practice. So for many of us, we have visualization practices of a Buddha figure. We might be doing the 6-element practice. We might be looking at the fetters, but we commit to awakening. So we commit to this insight or wisdom part of our practice. Without that, we can never be true individuals, I don't think. Without, in a way, this mode of reflecting on, we think, don't we, the way things are the way they are. But what we find in our practice is they're not the way we think they are. We are not some separate self rolling around in our heads. Yeah, we're much more intimately connected, much more interconnected. We're much freer than we think we are. We are a bunch of habits. And, it's like we step in to a different place. We're connected with the world and other human beings in a really different way. And in that way, we can become a true individual and join a community of other true individuals. And then together, those true individuals can do quite a lot for the world. So, Bhante would call it the bodhicitta arising, sense of what a true spiritual community can do, a true gathering of enlightened beings, has the effect or the force on the world. It's very, very strong, isn't it? What that group of true individuals could do. Just think of the Buddha. He was one person, and yet here we are 2,000 and odd years later, following what he taught. So one true individual can have a massive effect on masses and masses of people. So I'm just going to pose some questions for us to reflect on for this afternoon. And they're going to be looking at the group and the true individual and the spiritual community. So I'll put the questions up on the board, but I'll just read them out here, and then that will be the end of the talk for today. So the first one is, I think this is quite good reflection questions as well on the talk in general. So in what ways and at what times do you act like a group member and therefore not a true individual? So in what ways and at what times do you act like a group member? And then in what ways do you relate to the true individual? So in what ways can you practice to be more of a true individual? And then the third one is, what is your experience of Sangha? So in what ways have you experienced a group of true individuals in the Sangha? And in what ways could the Sangha be like a positive group? Yep. So in what ways have you, so what's your experience of Sangha? And in what ways have you experienced a group of true individuals in the Sangha? And in what ways can Sangha be a positive group or even a negative group? Yeah, I think maybe I'll just end on, because my mind works, it's very like this, my mind, very like intuitive processing. So when Bhante talks about the group and the spiritual individual and the spiritual community, I think he really is evoking something. And when you evoke things, it's like a model, yeah? Like a theory. So it's not like we go from being a group member to a true individual and part of a spiritual community. I hope I've kind of shown that. It's like we're living our lives, practicing these things that Bhante has given us. We're part of a much wider movement of people practicing that, not even just in Triratna, but way wider. And at times we act like we are a group member in the negative group sense. At times we get a glimpse of, and we can act like a true individual. And at times we feel like we're really in a spiritual community and it has particular qualities, and we really feel we're in it. And at times, the spiritual community can feel like hell. So there's a fluidity to this experience, even though I'm really pleased that Bhante evokes it in a somewhat structured way, because hopefully it's clear. But our lives aren't like that. Our lives aren't clear. They're messy, aren't they? And we go in and out of these things. And that's why it's such an exciting thing to practice, because if we were really clear and everything was all where it's supposed to be, well, I don't know what we'd be like, but we're not like that. So, it's good. They're good teachings, good things to sort of reflect on. And yeah, hopefully we'll have plenty of interesting discussions on this retreat. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.